Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. The World Bank has released a major report that shows where global economies stand in terms of closing down on gender disparity. According to this report, 6 European countries received top scores. These countries, which include France, Belgium, and Denmark, set benchmarks for other developed and developing nations to aspire towards. While the report states that there is evident progress, is the progress fast enough? The World Economic Forum projects it will take 170 years to reach gender parity globally. On tonight's show, we will discuss where gender disparity stands today and what needs to be done to close the gap. Joining us for this discussion today is Dr. Fauzia Saeed, who's a women's activist. Also joining us is Saman Ahsan, who is the head of Ending Violence Against Women, Governance and Human Rights, UN Women, Pakistan. Thank you both for joining us. Dr. Fauzia, let's begin with you. So when we're talking about gender parity, what needs to be kept in mind while we define this term? Is it access to equal opportunities or equal outcomes?
I would say that equal opportunities, because outcomes then depends on what is the input. It is the level playing ground that we talk about. A lot of times people create controversies because of the word gender equality, and I think that is also a very fair term to describe the issue at hand. So gender equality, gender parity, sometimes they hide behind it and say it's not really equality, it's according to capacity, you give them opportunities. So I actually do not mind using the word gender equality with a lot of confidence, because equality in terms of opportunities to build your own capacity, to provide opportunities for growth, to provide opportunities for exposure, and that is where we need equality. And then in terms of output, that is individual, and women and men are not homogeneous groups, they're diverse groups, and that is how the output should be based. But I think the input should be, or the opportunities available should be equal to both.
And Dr. Fauzia, you made an important point there. And Ms. Saman, when we're talking about gender parity and this conversation, and in order to have a more nuanced discussion, it's also important to bring in the concept of gender equity, and that women have been historically marginalized in many capacities. So how does that need to be kept in mind while we're moving towards economic empowerment?
I think I agree with you, of course, that women have been marginalized, and that's in every aspect of their life. So gender equity and gender equality are parts of the same terms that we use to empower women. So whether we aim for gender equity or equality, as you said, it's as Dr. Fauzia said, it's creating equal opportunities, and the aim is to get better outcomes. So when there's gender equity and gender equality, then there will be better outcomes for women.
Yeah. And when we're talking about creating equal opportunities here, what do you think remains to be the main hindrance here? Is it social structures, or are they legalities? Because this World Bank report states that most countries that rank highest do not have legalities hindering women.
I would say that everything is very interconnected. So when you have better legislation, both at the top level, at the normative level, and then you have better implementation of that, then slowly you can also change social norms. So when someone knows that if they inflict violence on women, they will be punished and there will be some kind of retribution, then it will slowly lead to social norms change. But the issues that women and girls face are everywhere. So within the social norms, within the legislative framework, within the societal norms, in their families, in access to education, access to healthcare, access to economic opportunities, the issues they face are in all aspects of their lives, and there needs to be a holistic response to that. You can't just address one area such as legislation and expect that it will change the lives of all women.
Definitely. Over there, legislation isn't the only thing that needs to be kept in mind. Implementation of legislation is another. Dr. Fauzia, while we're talking about this, and we're talking about how women are getting more and more empowered by the day, there are many retorts that come in, specifically from groups of men, which state that women are now moving towards wanting to be more privileged as opposed to having equal opportunities. How would you respond to that? Do you think women are wanting women privileges?
Okay, I think that the whole concept of gender equality threatens a lot of segments of the society. And rather than understanding it fully, they somehow feel like their powers will be taken away or their social status will be taken away. Anything that touches the status quo, may it be the class system, may it be the gender power divide, anything like that threatens people and it makes them uncomfortable. So it is inevitable that people try to either confuse or react or be defensive, and I think that whatever they do in reaction or as their defense, they churn out a lot of these concepts that they say either women will get double benefit, they have the privileges, plus they will have the rights, or they say that, oh, men, they joke about it and they create certain myths which blame women for whatever goes wrong. So all these are reactions that come because, and just like in this report also you have noticed, the World Bank report, that countries that try and make an effort for gender equality, they do have some kinds of reactions. And then they have to go back to the drawing board and come up with policies that take care of that reaction too. So I would say this is part of the reaction. I don't think women are at the level where they want the privileges plus the rights and this and that. We are struggling for women to become a complete human being or get the status in the society for a complete human being. So we have a long way to go. I don't think we are we're still kind of pursuing
Fauzia,
legislation or lobbying for legislation.
When you say here that women want to become complete human beings?
I'm not saying that they're not. I'm saying the society has not acknowledged them as a complete human being. It is always a secondary citizen, a secondary human. Because see, look at this, just the fact that it is 2019 and we are still lobbying for legislation which says at the age of 18, you consider us adults at the age of 18. So we are still lobbying for such basic rights. Just to have one adult age, like 3 different laws will have 3 different adult ages for us. So we are still struggling with very basics and we want to become like a complete human, complete citizen in the eyes of the society. Yeah. So even that is a struggle.
And Dr. Fauzia,
you're talking about fundamental human rights, not privileges.
Definitely.
So access to healthcare, living a life free of discrimination and violence. These are fundamental human rights. They're not privileges.
And Dr. Fauzia mentioned here how treating women like secondary citizens is still very widespread. And Ms. Saman Ahsan here, I'd like to ask you, what are the economic and political drawbacks that come about when women are given secondary status?
So women, when they are given secondary status, they don't achieve their full potential. In Pakistan also, and in many countries around the world, most countries around the world have actually not reduced the gender gap. There is a gender gap of the wages that a woman and a man get for the same kind of work. So first of all, they don't get equal pay. Secondly, a lot of women are not in the official labor force, so that means that they are deprived of certain rights and benefits. Yeah. Thirdly, when they are in the workforce, they often face challenges that men don't face. For example, in commuting to their works, they face physical abuse and harassment. There's also sexual harassment at the workplace. So women do lag behind because of all these issues that they face when they are trying to be economically empowered.
Ms. Saman, you mentioned here how women do not have equal rights as men. And one of the main things is the gender wage gap, and it exists in the US too, where a woman earns 80 cents of a man's dollar. What do you think is happening in developed nations here? We are seeing in developing nations, of course, there are many hurdles to overcome, but even in developed nations where over half a century ago the US passed the Equal Pay Act, we're still seeing such disparity. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it shows how entrenched these social norms and these behaviors are, and they are in most countries of the world. And it's taking even developed countries generations to make those changes. So it's a tougher uphill climb for developing nations like Pakistan.
Yep.
Okay, so you mentioned here how...
And I want to add to this, Meshal.
Yeah. Go on, Dr. Fauzia.
Okay. Can I add to this?
Definitely.
Okay. I fully agree with Saman, and in addition, I want to say that sometimes women are making choices. There is a lot of research about this, that women are making choices where they have flexible hours or where they are able to take care of their families also. And research has shown that sometimes they pick options which are not paying the same, the equal pay of a man. For example, high level positions, sometimes they opt out of very high level positions because of the flexibility that is required. So
Yeah.
it is not necessarily because of the gender gap, it is sometimes because of choices also. However, I must say the United States, you mentioned United States, and that you can see in the hierarchy of the countries, it does not really make top 10 countries. And the patriarchy is very entrenched and the discrimination is very much there. However, the main difference between the patriarchy and gender discrimination over there and in our countries, here it is more overt, there it is more subtle.
Okay, so we also have Sara Belal, who's a lawyer, joining. Thank you so much, Sara, for joining us. Sara, when we're talking about reforms here, is it enough to say that legal reforms will change the trajectory of how we view women, or is something more drastic needed in terms of cultural and social reforms?
I think the law is a reflection of where society is, and in the best cases, the law is actually ahead of society's values. So in that sense, I think legal reforms are absolutely essential as a critical first step, because they reflect a social contract of how we as a people, as a society, choose to treat our women.
Yeah.
And what we think they deserve and what laws are there to protect them, give them rights. So I think they're a critical first step. Obviously, they don't solve everything,
Yeah.
but they are an important first step nevertheless.
And what international laws and conventions exist there in order to close the gender wage gap, specifically discrimination against women at workplaces?
So, I mean, I can't speak about foreign jurisdictions, but I can tell you that under our own constitution, which, when I first arrived 10 years ago, after studying law abroad, I was really pleasantly surprised to see how wide-ranging our constitution in Pakistan was. And our constitution and the jurisprudence that's come after it categorically says that, we have absolutely equal rights as women. We have a right to equality under the law. And that's really where it flows from here. Now, Pakistan is also a signatory to some very important international conventions, especially under the GSP Plus mechanism. We signed the core human rights treaties, and we are bound to implement them. One of them, which is the CEDAW convention, is actually up for review. I mean, we've had a bunch of our state review is coming up in a couple of months. And that's a very, very important one to watch, because that's where the state of Pakistan faces the committee and actually engages with them and tells them what they have done to have economic and social cultural rights and rights for women. And the legislation and the reforms that we've introduced domestically to live up to those treaty rights.
Yeah. And Ms. Sara, here I want to talk specifically about the Me Too movement, which swept over the world. I wonder how it was adopted here in South Asia and how it has manifested differently. And do you think we have moved away from stereotyping and victim blaming?
Stereotyping who? Men or women?
Women.
I don't think any society in the world right now has moved away from stereotyping women. But I think it's an ongoing struggle, and I think the movement has been a very, very important step. And I think it started in a place where, it was just some of the worst forms of abuse. And, in Hollywood. And the worst part of abuse in Hollywood was that those narratives and that perception is the one that's echoed around the world. And young girls watch that. These are the men who are making those movies. These are the men who are writing those stories. So it was really critical that it started there.
Yeah.
I mean, in no way has it solved many of our problems, but the fact that, this has come as a force to be reckoned with, there's going to be ripple effects. And I think it's too soon for us right now in Pakistan to say what those effects are because I think we are still seeing them manifest themselves here. But obviously, it's a welcome anytime women stand up and talk about, the abuses that they suffer and have the courage to come forward and other women stand with them. It's always a positive step.
And Ms. Sara, I'm curious to know here, you as a professional lawyer, what have been the hindrances that you felt that you've had to face as a woman, if there have been any? And what do you think you have done to circumvent that, something that other women can also follow suit?
So, two things. My profession, the legal profession, even globally, is one of the most conservative and male-dominated professions. Most of the judges are male. Most of the bar communities throughout the world are male. So it's a profession that's riddled with latent sexism against women. In that sense, but still, nevertheless, Pakistan has produced some incredible female lawyers, and they continue to do that. So I think the more women that join the profession, that is an absolute key. And then the other thing is that, the more numbers there are, the more women that get elevated to the bench, that alters the dynamics of the way that we are perceived and treated within the community.
Yeah.
And also, most importantly, look, I don't have any other experience of Pakistan's legal system apart from being a woman. And the most that I can do is that we all, as women, in whatever profession that we are, we develop techniques to mitigate, the biases that exist against us.
Yeah.
And therefore, we develop different strategies. But I think the critical goal is that, at least in our, at Justice Project Pakistan, which is our company, we make sure that when younger women enter the profession and they go to court, there is not a culture of silence, or there is not a culture of denial, but there is a culture of listening and warning them and sticking together and saying, yes, this does happen.
Yeah.
Yes, you got treated this way, perhaps, not only because maybe you were young, but mostly because you're a woman. And to provide that space to have that conversation honestly amongst women, and then talk about techniques on how we can mitigate those risks and better protect them. And the more that women in our profession actually get unionized and get organized and fight for their rights, the better it's going to be that way as well.
And Ms. Sara, last question to you. You've talked about how women need to take ownership of this and need to move forward, but I wonder here, how should men be participating in this process, and how important it is for them to participate?
Yeah, so none of this is possible unless the people in power, who are the men in the system, are the ones who realize that they are hanging on to this privilege, and that they first have to recognize that there is a huge bias that exists, and that it is incumbent upon them to be allies. There was a brilliant article written by some female lawyers from Karachi talking about the profession. I think Fauzia Saeed was one of them. And it was a real, it was a real eye-opener for the men, actually, in the profession, at the level of pervasive sexism that exists for female lawyers, whether you are in court, whether you're in the office, whether you come from, a privileged background or a less privileged background. There were levels of sexism that existed across the spectrum. But instead of feeling threatened and defensive about it, the men really need to step up and recognize that it's a problem. And they are, this is not for us to say that every single male lawyer that has ever existed in Pakistan is a sexist, misogynist practitioner. But at the same time, it is their community that is responsible for the oppression. So they have to stand up and be good allies. And that begins, by the way, by just listening.
Yeah.
First, just listen. Don't tell us the solutions to our own problems. We know them, but have the patience to listen to what we have to say and to describe our experience about what has happened, and believe us when we say that has happened. Please don't blame it on something else, and then stand up and do the right thing.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sara Belal, for joining us, talking to us about this. Ms. Saman Ahsan, something that Sara Belal mentioned here was how there are so few female judges in in place and how female executives all over the world, not just here in Pakistan, but all over the world, make up a very small percentage. How important is it for female participation to be there in policy making and to keep in mind the fact that women bring a unique perspective, something that is different from men, to the table?
I think it's of critical importance to have women at the top level because they do bring a perspective that's different, and women will, when they are involved, then the measures taken are usually more equitable and pass on rights to other people also. So first of all, involving women in the top level leads to better outcomes. And secondly, involving women also shows other young women and girls who are watching that they can also reach that position. And they can serve as role models for others who aspire to be like that. And
tell us about the better outcomes
girls
here.
And young women, and for our future to So, for example, women are more equitable, and when they are involved in companies, they will have better policies that support women, for example, maternity leaves or daycare facilities. So they will look out for such measures that help women, help other marginalized groups perform better and and participate in the processes. But also, there's also been research that involving women in the top level of companies is also better for the economic and financial performance of those companies. There has been research on that as well. So not just from an equity perspective, but from an effectiveness and efficiency perspective also, women, when they're in the top positions, companies, governments, organizations, they do perform better.
So, Ms. Saman, since you mentioned here maternity leave, something that is emerging as a trend globally is that maternity leaves does not necessarily mean that women, when they return after giving childbirth, they're going to be able to earn the same as men. And even in Denmark, it's a disheartening trend to see that even in a country where there is generous paid leave and subsidized child care, women who have children suffer more compared to women who don't. What can you tell us about this and motherhood penalty?
I think you termed it correctly, motherhood penalty. That's the penalty that comes with being a mother. I heard a quotation somewhere that women who work are supposed, and who are also mothers, are supposed to work as if they don't have families, and they're supposed to take care of their families as if they don't work. So they have that double burden, and they have to perform 100% on both of those jobs that they are doing. And this is a challenge that all countries, women in all countries face. I don't think there's a country that has totally overcome it, even though Scandinavian countries have better examples. So the infrastructure, the systems, the processes can be put in place, and we can all try. For example, maternity leave is a great step. So a woman, and in Scandinavian countries, you might know that it's a joint maternity-paternity leave. So fathers also have the responsibility. And the leave that is provided, fathers can take a part of it and mothers can take a part of it. So the whole burden is not on the women. So such benefits to working mothers do help the situation, but of course we started from a really dismal situation, and all the countries are moving forward, some faster and some slower, and it will take some time to get there, but we do have to put in place those processes and mechanisms so that we can keep moving forward.
Definitely. And Dr. Fauzia Saeed, I want to talk a little about the World Bank indicators that were used, which included, and I'll read off the list, going places, starting a job, getting paid, getting married, having children, running a business, managing assets, getting a pension. And legal constraints which did not hinder any of these, that was used as a measure to see whether how much gender parity there was. But do you think these indicators are good enough? Because there are many informal constraints in place that prevent women from attaining equality or parity.
I think that is the problem with all these measures, GAD or GEM or the Economic Development Forum indicator report, and one wonders, sometimes you are even lower than Saudi Arabia, and many other countries like Philippines does not even have a divorce or birth control, and Pakistan is still lower, and you wonder what happened here. So I think that there is a problem because it is very difficult to measure these things, and there are so many of these subjective and subtle pressures on women that it is very difficult. So they have to kind of end up measuring very concrete things like income level and child mortality, and those are the kinds of indicators they can measure. So one has to look at it from that perspective, where you are a bit flexible and you don't really start believing that this is the thing and this is where Pakistan stands, but you kind of get an assessment, or you can get an idea of how the countries are rated. So I think that there are a lot of areas, a lot of indicators that are missed out. For example, sexual harassment or rape is one, but I feel that the biggest impact we have on women's life is the fear of rape. And you cannot measure the fear of rape, even though it influences the way I walk, the way I talk, the way I hold myself, the way I'm mobile, the way I pick my jobs or fields of education. But you cannot measure the fear of rape. And similarly, the fear of sexual harassment. If you allow me, I would like to expand a little bit upon the Me Too question that you asked, because I'm so closely related to that issue. I think that for Pakistan, Me Too started in 1998 somewhere. And also in 2012, we had a huge campaign we called it Speaking Out. And we went to all universities and we encouraged university students and other professional women to speak out, because by then we had a mechanism. We had 2 pieces of legislation in place. And so when we talk about Me Too, I really want us to think of Pakistan in relation to that, but also we have our own path. And while Me Too has focused more on media, women coming out and then accepting or kind of admitting it or claiming it on media. I think Pakistan had its own process
Dr.
of setting
Fauzia,
the
and that's a
mechanism.
very important point to make there, that Pakistan, like every other country, has its own path which should be measured. The progress that is made is measured accordingly. We have to go for a short break. When we return, we will discuss this further. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion, we are now joined by Laura Slimani, who's a French politician, member of the Generation S National Board and city councillor in France. Thank you so much for joining us, Laura. Laura, so the World Economic Forum stated in the Global Gender Gap report that the most challenging gender gaps are in relation to economic and political empowerment. What do you feel is the main hindrance here?
I mean, the main hindrance is thousands of years of patriarchy that have conditioned women's and men's behaviors in society. And so, of course, you don't achieve equality from one day to another. It takes time, but it also takes a lot of political willingness. And I think that what we've seen is that the countries that have put in the efforts, that have changed legislation, that have put in the means, the financial means to change things, are slowly getting there. So we need political willingness and we need financial means. I think these are the main 2 big aspects.
So Laura, you mentioned a very interesting point here, how women themselves are conditioned in a way to prevent political empowerment. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. How are women preventing themselves from becoming more politically empowered?
Well, it's very simple. I mean, we are not raised the same way boys are. So we're raised in a way that is encouraging us less to speak up, to think that we have something to say, that we have something to bring within society. And I think a very small example that I've got from my experience in France is, which is a fairly egalitarian country if you put it into comparison with the rest of the world, is that in my movement we opened up candidacies to all the members of our movement, and even wider than that, for people to put themselves forward for the European elections. Only 30% of these candidacies out of the over 900 that we got were women candidacies. 70% of them were male candidacies in a country where there are no legal barriers to women's political participation. So it is a part of a self-restraint that we put ourselves in, and we have to try and together overcome this.
And Laura, when we're talking about how women are prevented from coming forth, one of the main things is the stereotypes that prevent women from living up to their true potential. If women are go-getters, they're seen as being aggressive and unlikable. How do you think that works in politics as well?
Yeah, it's definitely true. I mean, there is a lot of sexism in politics. So basically, whenever, I mean, and in all areas where there is some power and some responsibility, if you're a woman, you're never going to have the right attitude. You're either going to be too shy or aggressive. You're either going to be too emotional or cold. So, you know, you're always going to face this kind of criticism. This is why I think the main aspect in political parties to make things change is to create strong solidarity among women. And I think this is very important, to have spaces where women can discuss the situation in the party and how they can improve it. And also you need to have structures that are equalitarian. You need to have as many women as men on boards, etc. This is also how you make things change.
And the report that we're discussing here, the World Bank report titled Women, Business and the Law 2019, has put 6 European countries at the top of gender parity. What do you think Europe is doing right and what it has done right in the last decade in terms of trying to close the gap, trying to close the distance between men and women?
It's, as I said, it's a long process that had started also years before, and so we're now seeing some of the results. But I think that the main thing is that in Europe now I don't think you have that many countries where you have even one piece of legislation that doesn't give women the same right as men. So this is one thing, you know, just put men and women on an equal footing on all of your legislation. And this is one step that I think Europe is ahead of the rest of the world on, even though some countries are still behind. And then, yes, I mean, you see the countries that have put more financial means into reaching out equality. For instance, Scandinavian countries, they have much better results than some countries even within Europe that haven't. And I think that what we're seeing, especially regarding labor, equality in labor, equality in wages, there are still significant inequalities in Europe. It's about women earn about 16.3% less than men in terms of wages. And the difference is, you know, you can reach equality when you actually sanction and control employers on their policies, when you actually have voluntary policies that encourage women to go into the more paid areas, but where you also kind of put more value and financial value into sectors that are widely occupied by women, the care sector, for instance, which is underpaid at the moment. So we need to work on all of these balances. And this is what is happening in Europe, but it's not going fast enough, I think.
Yeah. So Laura, you mentioned here how there is an evident wage gap still present. Another thing that emerged as a problem was a report released by Amnesty International, which in regard to Denmark's epidemic of rape and victim blaming in society stated that even though we see that it is a nation which is seen to be a benchmark for gender equality, for gender parity, there are many, many problems there. Could you explain to us exactly what's happening there on the legislative end, which is preventing for there to be a crackdown on violence against women?
Yeah, violence against women is definitely one of the black spots because it still exists everywhere, and it's very high on the priority of people, but still things are not changing as fast as they should. And the situation of Denmark is the same everywhere. You know, only 10% of rapes are actually put forward to the police by the victims. So there's a strong feeling among victims that basically being raped is somehow has got to do with being their fault, or that they're going to be shamed about it. So first of all, we have to change the way that we look at rape. It is violence. It is a violent behavior, and the victim is only a victim and is never guilty of what has happened to them, to her most of the time. I think that another thing that we need to do is to bring these victims more support by funding NGOs and actors that help them go to the police and actually file complaints against their rapist. And another aspect of this is also how we train better all the professionals that can be in touch with women who are victims of violence in hospitals, lawyers, in companies, in the justice system, in the police,
Yeah.
all these people need to be trained effectively so that violences are detected and that victims are properly supported in their process.
So Laura, hold on to that thought. I want to ask Dr. Fauzia Saeed in regards to this too. Something that you mentioned was how there needs to be a greater role played by NGOs. Dr. Fauzia Saeed, when we see there needing to be institutional change, what needs to be happening at the grassroots level for people to be mobilized in favor of women's right?
I think all the sectors of the society need to get active about it, because it starts from the government also. At the same time, we need to look at the grassroots level also. And it is not just the NGOs. NGO is a very strange term that was coined here, non-government organizations. But I think traditionally South Asia is very rich in terms of movements and volunteer initiatives, and then they range from registered entities to informal neighborhood groups to just general elders teaching and grooming the younger generation. So I think at all these levels, the attitude and the mindset has to be changed. For me, it is not for example, the wage gap. To me, the wage gap doesn't worry me as much as the acceptance of it, or like a non-caring attitude about it.
Yeah.
And that worries me more, because that shows the mindset and that shows the social side of it. So I think that the community itself has a lot to do with it. The movement should be nurtured and not be afraid of. Like right now, the civic space is reducing a lot, and I think that should be nurtured, that should be flourished. I think citizens themselves should take charge in terms of grooming the younger generation, in terms of changing the mindset, rather than shutting the NGOs down or kind of stigmatizing and demonizing the civil society. I think it is very important for the societies to chart out their own future.
Yeah, and an important point you mentioned there, something that I also want to ask Ms. Saman here, is in regards to the wage gap when we're talking about it and the acceptance of it. Women themselves often seem to not be aggressive enough when they're negotiating their pay, and much research suggests that and alludes to something known as a confidence gap, where women are told to accept what's given to them. What can you tell us about that, and how do you think systematically certain biases and stereotypes are ingrained in the society for this to happen?
I think this goes back to the way we raise our daughters and our sons, because girls are perceived as of less value than sons, and from the day they are born, they are given messages, whether overtly or more subtly, that they are less than boys, that they need to be second-class citizens, that they need to be quiet and accept their lot, they need to show patience. And this is in every sphere of life. So for example, Dr. Fauzia said that we accept the wage gap. In the same way, we accept violence against women. A lot of times, women and girls will not recognize that what they are suffering is violence. They will internalize it, they will normalize it, and because they don't see it as violence, they will not respond and they will not seek support for it. They will continue living in that way and suffering. So in a lot of the things, this is the way we are bringing up our society, our young people, and this has to change from that level, from the level of the family.
Yeah. Ms. Laura, I also want to ask your opinion on this. How credible do you think this phenomena of confidence gap is?
Well, I think, of course, everything that was said, I agree with. But I think we also have to be careful not to put too much responsibility on women themselves, because ultimately it's fair to ask also society to change. It's not only women who have to kind of close the gap. It is society that has to change, because this society is unequal. This society puts too much power into the hands of men. This society accepts these violences and these inequalities. So I think, it's both. Of course, we have to encourage women and empower them, but we also have society and political powers and governments have at all levels, as it was just said, have a huge responsibility in making it possible. It's too easy to say, oh, women, you have to negotiate your pay better. Well, what about wage transparency in companies. This would make it much more difficult for people to negotiate in secret their pay, and it would allow women to see how much less they are paid than men in the company and to organize against it.
So, Laura, when we're talking about the patriarchal structure here and it being resistant against the idea and concept that women should be given fair treatment, their rights, how do you believe society should be motivated to give women these gains? You are talking about a collaborative effort, but what can you tell us about how the economy benefits, how politics benefits when women are participating more in it?
I mean, of course, politics and society benefit more, but I think it's also a question of fairness and of equal rights. I mean, I don't think we should put conditions or ask for the gains. We are all born on the same earth. We are all entitled to the same rights, and these inequalities should not be tolerated. And I think it's of course, the question is often asked, what do society benefit from equal rights? Well, just the fact of being an equal society, and that is a benefit in itself. Then of course there are a lot of benefits, and obviously, women and men are not raised the same way, and I think it's also important to for women to have a say in the way that our society works, to change it. But I think we should not make it a condition to bring them equality. I think equality should be a goal in itself, without needing to be justified by bringing something more than just equal rights.
Okay, so I take your point there. We're also joined by Dr. Raana Malik, who's a professor of gender studies. Thank you so much, Dr. Raana, for joining us. While we're discussing women's rights and how gender disparity needs to be closed down on, how important is to keep in mind the concept of intersectionality, and that women are not a homogeneous group here, and that class differences, racial differences, and ethnic differences play a role?
Thank you so much for taking me on board, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this discussion. As it's already been discussed, now that how important are the women's rights, and as you said, that how the intersectionality and women being not in the homogeneous groups. Yes, it's true that Pakistan, it's a country, it's a society where we have a very large, very widened gaps between the classes. And here, when we talk about women's rights, we definitely have to look at the classes differently and how the women are actually working and executing in these classes. And when we take the lower class, for example, the ones which is the labor class particularly, there we see a very different situation. There we see most of the women who are working, and probably the less number of men who are mostly involved in drugs or things like that. So they are not supporting their families.
But so, Dr. Raana, even when we're talking about Pakistan, but also on a global perspective, there are many conversations which state now that the issue should not be about gender, but it should be about race when we're talking about unequal wage gaps, when we're talking about discrimination at work. How much do you subscribe to that idea and notion?
Sure. When we talk about women's rights, it's not something which is isolated from the society. It's the whole of the society. They are the part and parcel of the society. And when we talk about an equitable society, it means that the rights of all the sections in the society should be or must be at the equal position, at the balanced position. So it's not only women who are being discriminated, it's men also, it's the transgenders also, it's also the people in the other having other sexual orientations who are being discriminated. So it's not particularly that we would say that the women there are a lot of frictions in this society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Fauzia Saeed, when we're talking about how there are different unique challenges faced, can you tell us from a developing country's perspective, how are the challenges of economic empowerment different from those that women face in more developed nations?
Okay, before answering that, I just want to make a couple of points about the conversation that was going on. First, I want to say that this confidence gap, this term was coined, but I for one would not use it because it is too oversimplified. I think the issue is far more complex and it has a lot of social dimensions. So I would not just simply say women would not negotiate for higher salaries because they are not very confident. The other thing, I want to just make a very quick point about the equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes. I think outcomes will evolve, and if we cannot go backwards, we cannot say, okay, we want 50% women and 50% men in this organization, and then work backwards. I think we need to give equal opportunities, and then the outcomes will evolve, because otherwise we will reverse the process, and we will leave the merit, and we would just try and similarly in the parliaments and everywhere else. I think it will evolve as we do gender-friendly policies, as we implement those. Now, coming back to the challenges of the developing countries, I think that our economic equality, or if we look at that dimension, I think it is so dependent on our social side, the mindsets and the opportunities and political empowerment, that it is very difficult to comment specifically on that. However, the systems, there are two kinds of empowerment. I think one is a very personal process where you become aware of the changes within you, and one is where you have these societal mechanisms that are supportive. So in our case, I think even if women
Dr.
get
Fauzia,
personally empowered,
we're running out of time, so I'm going to put the same question to Ms. Saman Ahsan here. When we're talking about equal opportunities, what changes, what drastic changes need to come about in the mechanisms, in the economic mechanisms, for there to be equal opportunities?
I think we need to take steps at all levels. So like Sarah said, legislation is the first step that needs to improve. And once the legislation is improved, then the implementation and the monitoring of those legislations. And then working with, like Dr. Fauzia said, we have to work with all sectors of society. So be it the family, be it the community, be it NGOs or other movements, the government institutions, the duty bearers, service providers, civil society activists. So all of them need to take concerted efforts and collaborate in order to make the change. And change has to be at all.
Okay, so Laura, we have mentioned here how there needs to be collaborative efforts made. What can you tell us about what needs to be done on the international front? What conventions need to come about urgently in order to make sure that the world is moving in the right direction?
Well, internationally, I mean, the first thing we have to do is that no development aid should be given if there is not if it's not integrated into a gender approach, and if women's rights and gender equality is not included in it. So I think this is one thing that we have to do in Europe, at least, regarding this. And then I think it's not really about conventions, or new conventions, because there are quite strong ones, especially regarding women, violence against women and the Istanbul Convention. But it's making all countries ratify it, and then putting countries in front of their responsibilities in order to put the means in order to actually respect them. And this is also true for human trafficking. I think this is a big problem and we have to tackle it also.
Yeah, that's a very important point you made there. And Dr. Raana, on the educational front, what needs to be done in order to change conventions within societies? What needs to be brought about as an educational change?
I think that, as been said, that we have conventions. The problem comes to the implementation of this, the machinery which needs to reinforce those conventions and the treaties we have signed globally. But in education, it's been globally been seen that the women are they are excelling in their studies as compared to the men. And particularly in, like, if I talk about Pakistan and in universities, the tertiary levels, the girls are just ahead of the boys. In the universities of
and that definitely goes back to our main point. While there is high levels of education amongst women, there is something that's happening wrong at the implementation end, which creates equal opportunities, and that's something that governments need to look towards. Thank you so much, Dr. Raana Malik, for joining us, Saman Ahsan for joining us, Laura Slimani for joining us, Dr. Fauzia Saeed for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We'll see you again next week with more stories. Till then, take care.